Our first speaker is Melissa King, who directs the Writing Center and lectures in the English department at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. Her published work ranges from an examination of fashion writing in 19th century women's magazines to the language of modernism and romanticism in Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables series to issues of translation and illustration in variants of Rapunzel. Her current project largely focuses on documenting and interpreting early illustrated editions of Charles Perrault's Contes de Fées and charting how illustrations accompanying this collection intersect with anomalies in the collection's 18th century translations. So I believe that her paper today is part of this project on illustration, right? Okay, so please welcome Melissa King.
I just want to say thank you again for organizing this conference for us. I have never been more terrified and full of joy at the same time in my entire life, and it's because of you putting this together, Alessandro and Louis, so thank you very much. Is this okay? In the fascinating presentations of the past couple of days, we have had ample exposure to the transgressive and subversive texts that adapt to Bluebeard. We heard from Abigail how the use of patois in music and dance connect to the oppressor and the oppressed in Jamaican theater. We heard from Caroline about how Carmen Maria Machado creates a connected web, both fictional and semi-biographical work that in referencing Bluebeard addresses intimate relationship violence. And finally, last night we heard from Maria Tatar about the unconscious upcycling of the tale in films like Ex Machina and Get Out. For all Bluebeard fell out of favor in fairy tale collections in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time, as Laura Tosi showed us, even Shakespeare was being stripped of its complexity in child-friendly versions, which worked to reduce his complex language to plots and characters to starkly delineated categories of good and bad. This is a tale that has reemerged in adaptation with a vengeance. Maria Tatar notes in her seminal work, Secrets Beyond the Door, that Bluebeard's wife has been reinvented so many times that she has every right to complain of an identity crisis, as she points to how robust, quote, a culturally invisible story can be. It is indeed a robust tale. One only need to attend fabulous conferences at Brown to discover how many adaptations one has missed. At dinner the other night, Caroline asked me what some of my favorite Bluebeard adaptations are. I lamely listed the ones I intended to reference in this presentation: Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, Margaret Atwood's Bluebird's Egg, Kurt Vonnegut's Bluebeard, Catherine Breillat's film Barbe Bleue, and Helen Oyeyemi's Mr. Fox. Don't worry, I decided to curb myself a bit and not talk about all of these. The point is, for anyone captivated by this tale, this question is incredibly difficult to answer, but there is a distinct pattern in some of these adaptations. While they certainly grapple with the horrific violence of the tale, they muddy the waters. They dig into the relationship between Bluebeard and his last wife in ways that are uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because the villain, while still undoubtedly villainous, is rendered as fascinating in various ways to the young wife, and the young wife's reactions aren't just of fear and loathing, but attraction, if perverse attraction. In Adaptation and Appropriation, Julie Sanders argues that the aim of adaptation is, quote, not replication as such, but rather complication, expansion rather than contraction. And man, do these particular Bluebeard adaptations take the explicit themes of curiosity, disobedience, and violent spousal abuse and profoundly complicate them. I want to briefly touch on three: Breillat's film, Angela Carter's short story, and Helen Oyeyemi's Mr. Fox. Boyat's film adheres the closest to Perrault's tale by giving us a framed narrative of two little girls reading the story out loud. The inner narrative's adaptive complication comes with an emphasis on a poor, recently bereaved girl's money lust, but also an intimate connection formed between Bluebeard and his young wife through contemplative conversation and education. They have established he will not better out of respect for her young age, and she claims to miss him when he is gone. When she does finally unlock the room that houses his dead wives, she calmly walks around their hanging bodies in the pools of their blood. And when he proclaims her fate, she pleads that he not use the blade that killed his other wives, presumably because she is more special to him than all those who have come before her. She is frightened, but also jealous. The final scene shows her sitting like a melancholy Salome at a table, his head on a platter, with no trace of the relief and victory one would expect at having escaped an abusive tormentor. Relationship status. It's complicated. Excuse me. In a similar vein, Carter's story explores the complex feelings of the narrator wife who simultaneously desires and yet is disgusted by her husband and her desire. With the echoes of Du Maurier's Rebecca, Carter paints a picture of jealousy inherent in, quote, threadbare self-confidence, while setting out a lavish buffet of explicit references to sex and pornography. Ultimately, the timid piano-playing wife understands that her appeal is that in her innocence, the Marquise, quotes, sensed a rare talent for corruption. Throughout the story, Carter is constantly forcing us to wonder at the nature of consent and agency within such a psychologically and emotionally charged relationship. Relationship status. It's complicated. Finally, in Helen Oyeyemi's novel, Mr. Fox, is a dizzying mosaic of stories bound together in the form of a storytelling game played between a writer, St. John Fox, and his suddenly not-so-fictional creation, Mary Fox with an E. Reminiscent of the absurdist work of Luigi Pirandello, Mr. Fox's imaginary Mary slowly takes on tangible form, all while she and St. John take turns telling stories that make some reference to the larger Bluebeard canon. Mary initiates the game, ultimately to force him to recognize the villainous implications of his writing. And this actually reminds me of that conversation we were having last night. Can adaptation ever do bad? She tells him, quote, people read what you write and they say, yes, he's talking about things that really happen. And they keep reading and it makes sense to them. You're explaining things that can't be defended. And the explanations themselves are mad, just bizarre. But you offer them with such confidence. It's obscene to make such things reasonable. To which he replies, shrugging, these are our circumstances. I'm just trying to make sense of them. He goes on also to say, people die, does it matter how? And she's like, yes, it matters. The imaginary Mary's manifestation in tangible form, which ultimately leaves the imagination and the house of the Bluebeard who formed her. She goes off to see the world. Shows the terrifying yet wondrous power and potential of storytelling to manifest countless readings from one source. All of this and so much more stems, at least predominantly, from Charles Perrault's print tale, a tale that on the surface seems a simple enough depiction of a wife who does a thing and nearly gets murdered by her husband, ostensibly for doing that thing. So how do we get from point A to point B? How does catfishing and attempted murder get translated into complicated, complex, and confusing intimacy? I would argue that the answer to this, the missing link, is both the surprising subversiveness of Perrault's prose and its ability to prompt adaptation in the form of illustration that worked to complicate the text from its very first print appearance. Okay, a little context, and I know not everybody needs this, but I'm just going to throw it out there just in case. The French style. There was a great deal of discontent brewing in France in the late 17th century, especially, but not exclusively, amongst aristocratic women, and no wonder Louis XIV's proclivity for waging costly wars was fueled by excessive taxes, and the countrywide financial deterioration resulted in the need for austerity even in the bourgeoisie and aristocratic classes. His increasingly conservative cultural policy fed censorship and imprisonment. Upper-class women struggled to assert any rights to a rigorous education and the choice and freedom to marry. This is the climate in which the French salon was conceived and thrived. Given the historical and political context of the salon phenomenon as a forum in which to criticize the state of France at this volatile time, Jack Zipes notes that, quote, "There is something inherently suspicious and perhaps subversive about the development of the literary fairy tale, and these tales in particular, marked as they were by sadomasochistic and macabre elements." He goes on to point out that, quote, "This cruelty in the tales is connected to forced marriage or the separation of two lovers who come together out of tender feelings for each other and not because their relationship has been arranged." As it was the actual plight of many female writers at this time, the stories struck a chord and were taken seriously in spite of their often outrageous sentimentality. This is the milieu in which Charles Perrault's fairy tales were formed. These tales are part of that subversive fabric, yet his literary style stands somewhat apart from the work of the late 17th century conteuses, his contemporaries, in this seeming simplicity. In his dedication to the Princess d'Orléans, he himself points out the, quote, "childish simplicity of these stories," or récits, but he immediately implores his reader not to blame him, because the tales, quote, "almost always contain a very wise lesson, which becomes more or less apparent according to the sharpness of the listener's perception." I'm actually using Boddigheimer's translation as it appears in Christine Jones' refiguring Mother Goose, which is a fabulous book, by the way, if you haven't read it. But I do want to point out that what she translates as sharpness is this word penetration, which is an interestingly ambiguous word and decision of translation. Indeed, the third tale in his Histoire conte au temps passé, La Barbe Bleue, might not seem particularly complex by our 21st century expectations, especially in its numerous English translations, which before the recent more nuanced translations by scholars like Christine Jones, all hail, I love her, bypassed, quote, and this is her quote, "the strangeness of 17th century French." The tale is driven by action with seeming little characterization. The eponymous character known only by his alarming facial hair and his latest bride not named at all, and no interiority with which to assess any motivations or feeling behind the character's actions. In fact, if we consider the act of storytelling a type of translation itself, bear with me, with life as it is experienced by real people, the source language, and the tale as the target language, to use the language of Vinet and Darbonnay in their 1958 methodology for translation, it's tempting to consider Perrault's text a poor translation of life into tale, a text that doesn't allow for complicated feelings and relationships. But if we heed Perrault's entreaty, we recognize that La Barbe Bleue is far from this. Its combination of deliberately naive style with subtly rich language makes it a powerfully adaptable ur-text. Its resistance to representing any specific interiority means that there is vast potential to tease out what isn't translated from the source language, in this case, real life. And that is precisely what we see with this tale from its first print debut in 1697, where already the sole illustration creates, to reference Martine Hénard's study of the modern fairy tale, the first palimpsestic layer by depicting something not explicitly present in the narrative. Bluebeard, behind the walls of his castle, with curved sword poised to strike the head off his bride, donning, of all things, a turban. The rampant orientalization of Bluebeard from that point on in English translation, in illustration, and in other forms of adaptation into different media, including the British burlesque theater, offers up its own wildly transgressive portrait, which I'm not going to talk about today. Too bad. It's really cool though, check it out. But here I'll be considering something more subtle yet still really intriguing, a handful of illustrations from French editions of Perrault's collection published in the century after their original publication date. Incidentally, right smack dab in the Reign of Terror in the First Republic of France. All right. This is where we get into the good stuff. Might be boring for you. This might be the boring part of the presentation, but this is where I start down like, let's look at the pictures. It all starts with this copper engraving, which adapts the gouache from the singular 1695 dedication manuscript. This is the gouache. First published by in 1697 by Claude Barbon, and is attributed to Antoine Clusier. And it was reprinted and pirated in many editions of Perrault's tales throughout the 18th century and even up into the 20th century. Daphne Hugenbosom not only notes how rare and unusual it was for Perrault's tales to be illustrated at this time, when other fairy tale collections were not, but points out the similarity in these naive anti-classical illustrations to mid-16th century collections of emblems and fables. As with both emblems and fables, the illustration was crucial to an understanding of the text, and Hugenbosom argues that the naive style of the gouaches and then of the copper engraving adaptations not only supports Perrault's place in the quarrel of the ancients and moderns, but underlines the deliberate simplicity of his prose. It's significant that the first image to accompany Perrault's tale should focus on this crucial, violent moment. Bluebeard raising his blade, his wife kneeling and praying below him, her sister Anne looking out from the parapet, and her brothers on the verge of entry, when there are other parts of the text that might just as readily be read as emblematic of the whole. Perrault's gouache and then Clusier's copper engraving would be so powerful that every illustration of the tale from the 18th century would cling close to that moment, nearly. Oh, nope, you can't see that yet. All right, I'm just gonna go back to that Clusier. Clusier's engraving was the only illustration of La Barbe Bleue until the 1742 Costelier edition with illustrations by Simon Fulca. Although he sticks to the same general scene as Clusier, he picks it up just a moment later after the brothers have slain Bluebeard. Where there's little ambiguity in Clusier's illustration, Fulca's placement of the characters leaves the scene open to interpretation. We're gonna see a close-up of this in a second, so, hold on to your knickers. Bluebeard lies on the ground, his sword tucked non-threateningly under his body, rather than brandished above his head as in the Clusier. His head is bare and vulnerable. His position deprives us of seeing any detail of dress. Fulca's illustration is dynamic, and the movement is focused conspicuously on Bluebeard's wife. What is she doing? Is she falling into her brother's arms, or is she pushing against him? Is her brother catching her or barring her from the slain Bluebeard? Unlike this 1850 illustration from Dean's Penny History, where we see her kind of, very clearly clutching her brother and being stabbed, and there's really no kind of connection there. There's the close-up I promised you. Fulca's placement and angle is inscrutable. Fulca's work was repeatedly reprinted, allowing for increased exposure to this ambiguous interpretation of Perrault's tale. Let's just stew on that for a second. The 1785-86 Marlier and Ghent illustrations harken back to that explicit violence of Clusier's work, with an enhanced focus on Bluebeard's menacing expression and grasp on his bride's hair. Interestingly, Clusier's original copper engraving registers this hair-pulling detail, but actually many of the copies in their crudeness do not, and the 3rd and 4th Robert Sandburg English translations show Bluebeard kind of looking like he's caressing his wife's head more than pulling it up for the blade, like. So the encounter, and I just want to go back to that for a second, because that's bad. That doesn't look good. That's not a lot of opportunity to interpret that in any other way. The brutal violence of that illustration, though, renders this next. Okay, I feel like I need to pause because this is the illustration that started it all. So just imagine, set the scene. I'm sitting in the Morgan. I've made them pull every copy of Perrault that they have. I'm flipping through and I find this illustration and I'm like, what? So this is the illustration that started it all, and here it is. We'll get a close-up of that too. So that violence makes this all the more surprising. This is an unsigned illustration, unlike the ones that we've been looking at so far. And it is from the 1797 edition published by Chez Devaux. And in this, we see the illustrator focusing on the moment directly between the previous two that we looked at. Bluebeard is still alive, still standing, but the focus of the violence is dramatically shifted. And we see Bluebeard being actively stabbed. Oh, whoop. No, that's okay. I meant to do that. Yeah, unlike Gustave Doré's 1862 illustration of that same moment, where his bride very obviously, I mean she's in the shadows, but she's lying faint in the background. Close up. The Devaux illustration depicts Bluebeard and his bride seemingly making eye contact and reaching for each other, like lovers who are being separated against their will. Oh, no, we don't want that yet. The seeming disjunct between text and illustration is jarring, at least at first. That is, until we return to Perrault's own admission of the deliberate simplicity of the narrative. Simplicity that is meant to be penetrated by a strong perception. Perrault further discourages the reader from an overly simplistic reading of his simple style by offering two morals that contradict each other. One of which says, hey ladies, curiosity isn't worth it, and the other which dismisses the idea that a modern husband would be capable of the horrors depicted in the tale. The contradictory nature of the morals prompts us to not necessarily dismiss them, but acknowledge that there isn't one clear reading of the tale. Simon Foucault and the unsigned Devaux artist are extraordinarily transgressive in the resistance to an overly simplistic interpretation of Perrault's narrative. Their illustrations suggest and even encourage alternate readings and adaptations of the tale. They suggest that even in the most seemingly clear-cut scenarios, things might be more complicated than they seem. And they are the first adaptations of Perrault that pry open the tale and tease out a potential sense of interiority that ultimately help pave the way to the sorts of adaptations that we looked at the beginning. I know you all wondered, why is she talking about these adaptations when we're supposed to be talking about early editions of illustrations? All right. If we concur with Nilce Pereira that illustration is a kind of inner semiotic translation, and that, quote, illustration can also be seen as another way to create meaning for the text, then it's possible that illustration as adaptation has the power to transgress the seeming boundaries of the literary text and express something unspoken or unspeakable. Binet and Darbonnet describe the far reaches of translation as adaptation, where the, quote, type of situation being referred to by the source language is unknown in the target language culture. These illustrations suggest a kind of reversal of that model, in which the adaptation, in this case, the target language, attempts to express a problematic idea not explicitly addressed in the source language, that is, Perrault's tale. And in this case, perhaps the complicated and often confusing threads of any intimate relationship, and especially these kinds of abusive relationships. Referring to the tale as a particularly potent form of marriage counseling, indeed, Maria Tatar argues that, quote, if Bluebeard's wife is scared out of her wits, her story also teaches listeners how to take the experience shared through the folktale and how to use it to sharpen their own wits. I would add to this that the kind of transgressive adaptation we see in these early illustrations, and then ultimately in many 20th and 21st century texts in connection with their source text, offers us an expansive space where we sharpen our wits in part by acknowledging that human relationships, even, and maybe especially those like abusive relationships, to which we feel we should be able to have a clear-cut and simple reaction and response, do not always afford that luxury. Victims of abuse return to their abuser again and again and again, to the point where it is not enough to simply offer a cautionary message to not do it. Adaptations from these fascinating illustrations on up to modern retellings acknowledge the complicated emotional web of abuse and say, this is not easy, and you are most definitely not alone.